Okay, this morning we are going to be looking at the rise of Babylon. So, in case you want to know what this illustration is of, this is in the British Museum. Interesting writing, is it? Can you imagine trying to read that? But that is a stone found in 1803 describing the achievements of Nebuchadnezzar. Actually, it's quite a good-sized stone. It's quite a good one, but I like the close-up picture of the writing. That was quite good. Babylonian history. The history of the empire, there's actually two empires. And so you got an early empire, you've got a late empire. I'm going to talk about them both. The early doesn't really impinge upon what we're doing here, but does impinge upon other aspects of the Old Testament scriptures. Whereas once we get to the Neo-Babylonian Empire, we are talking about Nebuchadnezzar and that era. So that does impact on the divided kingdom. So what we're going to be looking at is this. We're going to have a look at the Old Babylonian era, look at some initial kingdoms, expanded kingdom under Hammurabi. Hopefully that's a name that we are familiar with, Hammurabi. And then the collapse of that Old Babylonian kingdom. And then we'll move on to looking at the emergence of a world power. So the ascendancy of Babylon, Babylon as the world power, and the collapse of the Neo-Babylonian Empire. We'll just mention that. And then also just look briefly at the land of the exiled Jews. The three deportations, we'll mention the conditions in the exile, and the fact they end up settling really in Babylon for an extended period. So that's roughly what we're planning to cover over the next 55 minutes or so. Initial kingdom of Babylon was under a chap named Sumu, S-U-M-U, Abum, hyphenated, A-B-U-M, Sumu Abum. So the kingdom was founded by Sumu Abum around 1897 BC, and he lasted about 1883 BC. And it was only really in that area where Babylon was. He was a local Amorite chieftain. He managed to capture a small, insignificant city called Babylon, but small and insignificant at that point in time, from a fellow Amorite. And the Old Babylonian era was defined by the dynasty that he started, lasted for about 300 years. And if you're familiar with that time scale, sort of almost 1900 BC up to about 1600 BC, we're talking Abraham's day. So, and there's going to be some influence there on Abraham there as well. So Babylon remained, for the next 100 or so years, a rather small and unimportant sort of city-state until the reign of Hammurabi. And he's the one that really expanded things. The expanded kingdom under Hammurabi, he lived from 1792 BC to around 1750 BC, thereabouts. He was the sixth Amorite king of that dynasty from Sumu Abum. The first few years of his reign were very peaceful, and he used the time to expand Babylon's defenses. He heightened the walls, he expanded the temples, and in expanding the city, he established a very effective government. He formed alliances with other city-states, also defeated them. So you sort of form an alliance and you sort of take it. He just expanded out. Within a short time, or there's Elam as well, who's, notice they're sitting down here. Susa, hopefully we know something about from biblical times, but not yet. But Elam is sitting down here. Elam attacked him, so he formed an alliance with other city-states and defeated Elam. Within a short time, he drove Elam out of southern Mesopotamia. They had been in control of the region for hundreds of years. So he helped put down Elam. He then slowly began to conquer the rest of the city-states, large sections of modern Iran, eventually all of northern Mesopotamia and Syria, including the powerful Amorite kingdoms of Mari and Yamhad. You see Mari up there on the left. I'm not sure where Yamhad was. This map, by the way, you can find on Wikipedia. And so it's free to use. He even conquered the early Assyrians before they were a major empire. He ousted their king, put the king's son on the throne, and forced him to pay tribute. So he's quite a powerful person at that point in history. He succeeded in just a few short years in uniting all of Mesopotamia, that bit between the Tigris and the Euphrates, all of Mesopotamia under his rule. Although there's a lot of cultures that coexisted at that time, under his rule, what became known as really the Old Babylonian culture became the dominant culture of the literate classes. So his became what was known. It had an influence on us, by the way, in Britain as well, as I'll get to. We have a large number of contract tablets. Mind you, when they wrote, it was largely on stone, and stone preserves really well. And so you'll clay and then bake it. So we've got a lot of those. But his own letters, we have about 55 of them, which is probably quite good for something that's 4,000 years old. He died in 1750 BC, and the kingdom passed on to his son, but he was unable to hold it together like his father had. All of really Hammurabi's work began to unravel. Abraham would have been familiar with Hammurabi. He'd been known as Abram at the time, or Abram at the time, because we lived in the land of Ur. Ur, of course, is sitting down there. That's part of Hammurabi's kingdom. So he would have been familiar with Hammurabi. So all that. Anyway, what we really remember Hammurabi for is the Code of Hammurabi, as we call historically. And this is from the Louvre. This is a depiction of Hammurabi standing on the left and receiving his royal insignia from a god, whether it's Shamash or possible Marduk, we're not sure, but he's receiving. So basically you put that up to say, I'm here because the gods wanted me here. So it works. But the Code of Hammurabi, he claimed to have received it from this god, if this is Shamash, because that was the Babylonian god of justice. Unlike earlier law codes, which had focused on compensating the victim of the crime, the law of Hammurabi was one of the first to place greater emphasis on the physical punishment of the perpetrator. So you can see how that's influenced ours as well. And it detailed very specific penalties for each crime, what was to happen to the person. It's one of the first codes to establish the presumption of innocence, as well as limit what a wronged person was allowed to do in retaliation. The law code consisted of 282 laws, which dealt with a wide range of issues, with each crime receiving a specific penalty. It was very much based on the eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth philosophy. It's called the lex talionis philosophy. But the 282 laws were written on 12 tablets in Akkadian language, which was the common language of the empire at the time. Any literate person could read it and have access to it. And what they would do, that's the top of that, as you can see. And if you can look real close, you might be able to see it. There's writing this is the Code of Hammurabi. So this is one, and they'd set these up in some of the towns. There was one in Ur of the Chaldees. That's why I'm pretty confident that Abram would have known something about Hammurabi. In public places, this particular one was found in 1901 and is now in the Louvre. Not the earliest law code, but one of the most influential law codes. So that's what Hammurabi did for the world. So we owe that to Babylon, Old Babylon, mind you, Old Babylon. Hammurabi has had a lot of influence. While he was alive, he was viewed by many as a god. So they really thought something of him. His personal name is Hammurabi Eli, which literally means Hammurabi is my God. He was virtually worshipped, and that was in common use both during and after his reign. This, by the way, picture here is from the British Museum, so you can go have a look at Hammurabi if you're down there. But this is what they call a votive monument. Hammurabi's raising his arm. You can just almost see it there in worship. So that's in the British Museum. But after his death, Hammurabi was revered as a great conqueror who spread civilization, forced all people to worship Marduk, the national god of the Babylonians. In writings from shortly after his death, Hammurabi was recognized in his era for 3 achievements. He's recognized for bringing victory in war for Babylon. He's recognized for bringing peace. It's interesting, known for war, but peace, because you conquer them, then you get peace. There you go. War and peace, and also for bringing justice. The justice, of course, through his law code. As I mentioned, there was a stela that was put up in Ur that glorified him as a mighty ruler who forces evil into submission, compels all people to worship Marduk, which says that he continued to put straight their confused minds. You read his law code, your mind will be straightened out. And that's what he was thought of. His military accomplishments in conquering the lands around Babylon, expanding the kingdom, were immense, but it's really his role as the ideal lawgiver that he's remembered for. For later Mesopotamians, his reign became the reference for all events occurring in the distant past. You went back to Hammurabi. Even after the empire he built collapsed, he was still revered as the model ruler. Many kings across the Near East claimed him as their ancestor. But if you want justification for your ruling, well, my ancestor was Hammurabi, whether I can prove it or not. And so they would claim him. He was rediscovered by archaeologists in the late 19th century and has since been seen as an important figure in the history of law. Because of this reputation for being a lawgiver, you can find his depiction throughout the world on law buildings. They'll put Hammurabi, and because of what he did there. So he was the first major. Doesn't really influence divided kingdom, but it does influence Abraham and what's going on in Abraham's day. The collapse of the Old Babylonian Kingdom took place after his son. His son was Samsu-Illunim, and initially it's in the north that the Assyrians, you see they're starting to come through here, began to encroach upon his kingdom. After he died, they drove out from that northern area. They drove out the Amorites and the Babylonians about 1740. So I think it's about 10 years after his death. The Assyrians are on the upswing, not the ones we're really dealing with. This is about 1,000 years before that. But they are becoming a nation at that point. About this time, others in the far south of Mesopotamia rebelled as well, and they overthrew the Babylonian rule and established what was called the Sealand dynasty. The Assyrians continued to expand the territory in the north, the Sealands in the south, Elam's making a resurgence, that's in the east, and the Kassites in the northeast. I don't think they're on our map, although this is Babylonia at the time of the Kassites. So about 13th century BC, we are here on this map. The Old Babylonian era ended with Babylonian quickly being reduced to a city-state, just like it was at the beginning, and then the Hittites sacked and conquered it in 1595 BC. In 1595 BC, we're still probably 100 years or so, 150 years before, about 100 years before Moses. So that puts you in a slight context there. But the Kassite dynasty ruled over this area for the next 400 plus years. And so they're the ones in charge. They adopted, though, many aspects of Babylonian culture, including adopting Hammurabi's law code. So they had a big influence on the world. The kings of the area continued to claim Hammurabi as their ancestor as well. But during this time, a number of the kings of Judah and Israel, during most of the time of the kings of Judah and Israel, this area, those under control of the Neo-Assyrian Empire. So that comes just a bit later. It begins emerging as a world power quite a bit later. It's during the time of the divided kingdom, we see the resurgence of Babylon. This, by the way, is a relief. This is in the British Museum. This is Babylonian prisoners that are under an Assyrian guard during the reign of Ashurbanipal, who were introduced yesterday. And this is from Nineveh. But that's what that's depicting. But anyway, Babylon, as they begin to reassert power, they want to throw off Assyrian rule. Naturally, they want to become an independent nation again. We see some of this when the delegation from Babylon visits Hezekiah. We'll talk more about that later. That's in 2 Kings 20, Isaiah 39. But they were looking for an ally in Judah against Assyria. If you're going to attack the major world power, you need allies. When Merodach-Baladan, king of Babylon, heard that Hezekiah had not been well, he sends letters and a present to Hezekiah by an envoy, because that's when Hezekiah showed him all his stores of treasure. He was showing what a good ally he would be. Of course, Isaiah confronted him, if you remember. Who were these men? What did they want from him? And Hezekiah told him they were from a far country. They're from Babylon. And Isaiah then told him that why he had shown them. He asked him what he'd shown them, and Hezekiah says, I showed him everything. And then as a result of doing that, Isaiah told him that everything in his house would one day be carried to Babylon. Nothing would be left. Even his sons would be taken away to become eunuchs, who were the officials at the time. And think about Daniel in particular, and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego there. The big eunuchs in the palace of the kings of Babylon. Hezekiah responded, if you remember, that the word of the Lord was good, because it wasn't going to happen during his days. No, we'll look at that again later on. But because God has already told him that throughout your reign, you're going to have peace. And he's going to have 15 more years. So just keep all that in mind. So although this partnership with Babylon was successful at first, it ultimately failed. And Sennacherib, king of Assyria, suppressed rebellions in Judah and suppressed rebellions in Babylon. So you've got this vying for power going on. Assyria is the world power, and Babylon wants to oust them in particular. It was not quite 100 years later that Babylon comes into her own. The Babylonian king is Nabopolassar, 626 to 605, took advantage of a period of Assyrian weakness after the death of Ashurbanipal, and declared that Babylon was now an independent kingdom. If you don't think that puts the cat amongst the pigeons, it definitely does. So that really is, though, the beginning date of the Neo-Babylonian Kingdom. It wasn't until Assyria was defeated, and that they defeated the Assyrians, that they really became the world power. It was in 616 that Nabopolassar launched an invasion of Assyria, which brought it almost a decade of incredibly brutal warfare between Babylon and Assyria. And we saw some of the brutality of the Assyrians. Babylonians are just as bad, okay? And so very, very brutal warfare. We'll talk more about that later as well. But Assyria received help, though, from an unexpected source, which kept them in power for a while. Egypt, who had been their enemy. But Egypt keeps them struggling on during this time. And this here is a photograph, of course, of Ashurbanipal. But he's there reviewing booty from the capture of Babylon. And again, this is down in the British Museum. And there's another little picture of Ashurbanipal. You do like the beards, don't you? And they did the beards so well there. But I couldn't braid them out if I had to. But anyway, that's the stela of Ashurbanipal. I took that in the British Museum. F.F. Bruce wrote in his Israel the Nations, for another former subject of the empire, Psamtik of Egypt was not minded to see a strong successor to Assyrian power established on his Asian frontier. A weakened Assyria suited him well, enabled him to extend his influence over the Syrian provinces, which had formed part of the Egyptian empire in imperial days of old. So we not only have Babylon flexing their muscle, we've got Egypt flexing their muscle as well. And Assyria's already been down and conquered Egypt a bit. But now they're starting to rise up through Psamtik, appointed by Assyria. But they're coming to Assyria's rescue this time because they don't like the idea of Babylon becoming the world power. So they're going to prop up Assyria to keep Babylon subdued. By the way, a little photograph there of Psamtik. And it's I think this is from the British Museum as well. But for 11 years, Egypt tried to shore up a tottering Assyrian empire. Their thinking is, if we can keep Assyria as a buffer between Babylon and us, we'll be in good shape. And we won't have to worry as much. With the Median Empire emerging as well, and also taking on Assyria, Babylon makes an alliance with Media, and together they conquered Assur and Nineveh. So this initial alliance between Media and Babylon was cemented, brought together, made permanent by Nebuchadnezzar's marriage. His father arranged, Nebuchadnezzar was the crown prince, the son of Nabopolassar, and he married a Median princess named Amytis. This, by the way, is a Babylonian chronicle written in the British Museum, and it details the fall of Nineveh. And so if you could read that, you could read all about it. And I sure can't read it, but anyway. In 612, Nineveh falls to the Median Cyaxares, 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 something like that, and Nabopolassar, which, by the way, fulfilled Nahum's prophecy after a siege of 2.5 months. This is a painting of that by John Martin in 1829. But in all practicality, that was the end of Assyria as a world power. They did hang on for a few more years. There's a battle of Carchemish later on. They do hang on, but for all practical purposes, they're not the world power now. Babylon is very much on the ascendancy. This is what Nahum wrote about, what was going to happen. Woe to, again, this is about Nineveh. Woe to the city guilty of bloodshed. She's full of lies. She's filled with plunder. She has hoarded her spoil. The chariot drivers will crack their whips. The chariot wheels will shake the ground. The chariot horses will gallop. The war chariots will bolt forward. The charioteers will charge ahead. Their swords will flash and spears will glimmer. There'll be many people slain. There'll be piles of the dead and countless casualties, so many that people will stumble over the corpses. And he goes on to the end of that chapter saying, "You shepherds are sleeping, O king of Assyria. Your officers are slumbering. Your people are scattered like sheep on the mountains. There's no one to regather them. Your destruction is like an incurable wound. Your demise is like a fatal injury. All who hear what has happened to you will clap their hands for joy, for no one has ever escaped your endless cruelty." That's Nahum. You can read the bit in between later in chapter 3. But yeah, so that's what the prediction, that's exactly what happens. So Babylon, under Nabopolassar, is now established as the world power. They've sort of defeated Assyria, and they're going on from there. Harrison, in his book Old Testament Times, says the Tigris was used as a boundary for divvying up the empire, the Babylonians taking the territory to the west and south, while the Medes occupied the land to the north and east. The marriage of the daughter of the Median Kingdom to Nebuchadnezzar II, son of Nabopolassar, completed the proceedings, and the new Babylonian Empire arose. Notice the dates of that: 612 to 539. Less than 100 years. is going to be the extent of the Babylonian Empire. We read about it, we see all the stuff they have in the British Museum and all that they accomplished. It was a very short-lived, less than 100 years. It rose and fell. So very, very interesting. Egypt wasn't happy that Nineveh fell. And as it was the other world power, they continued propping up Assyria for a few more years. As I said, they wanted this buffer between themselves and Babylon. And so in 609 BC, Pharaoh Necho of Egypt moved north to aid Assyria. And he was blocked by Josiah. We'll get to that tomorrow. And he was killed in battle. In the meantime, Nebuchadnezzar led the Babylonian forces to defeat Assyria at the Battle of Carchemish. And this is a depiction of the Battle of Carchemish from 1900 in Hutchinson's Story of the Nations. So whether it probably didn't look like that, but it's a picture, so they put it up. So Necho arrives at Carchemish, drives Nebuchadnezzar out, though. And Carchemish, for a time, became an Egyptian stronghold. On his return to Egypt, Pharaoh Necho picks up Judah's king Jehoahaz and took him to Egypt. He was the first Judean king to die in exile. And he set a heavy tax on Judah, appointed his brother Eliakim as king, changed his name to Jehoiakim. Nebuchadnezzar, as the leader of the Babylonian army, then moved up the east bank of the Euphrates early in August 606 BC and attacked Pharaoh Necho at Carchemish. We're going to have another battle going on there. Nebuchadnezzar then pursued, he won that one, pursued Necho all the way to the border of Egypt. And again, if you're going to Egypt, you've got to go through Israel, Judah. You've got to go through that area. And so he went past Jerusalem, and he defeated Pharaoh Necho. So Babylon is now the world power, unquestionably. And Judah was part of the new Babylonian Empire because he had gone through there. And so this is the Babylonian Empire during this sort of time period. You see how much territory they conquered. I mean, they're all the way down into the edge of Egypt, all the way down into Arabia, Red Sea area. So the major world power. In August of that year, Nabopolassar, Nebuchadnezzar's father, died in Babylon. Now, Nebuchadnezzar is the general. His son, yes, crown prince, yes, but he's also the general. So he's out in war, and there he dies. So what does Nebuchadnezzar have to do? He needs to hightail it to Babylon to be able to secure the throne, make sure his brother doesn't take it from him. So he stops pursuing Necho and goes back to Babylon. But when he goes back, he takes members of the royal families of the lands he's conquered. That included from Judah, Phoenicia, Syria, Egypt, and took them back to Babylon as captives. With one battle, all that Egypt had been controlling is now under the control of Babylon. So he has established the Babylonian Empire, really. Harrison says the evidence presented by Daniel in chapter 1, verse 3 would indicate that Nebuchadnezzar required the presence of Judean hostages in Babylon in 605 BC as evidence of good faith on the part of Jehoiakim. It's the one that Egypt had put in as king. Daniel himself was among those deported to Babylon under this provision, along with members of the royal house and some of the intelligentsia of Judah. So he's taking care of all of that. That's our first deportation from the kingdom of Judah to Babylon. It takes place there in 605. Nebuchadnezzar then took a personal, he sent them back. They would have gone back up around the Fertile Crescent, as we call it. From what the historians say, F.F. Bruce suggests that he, to get there faster, cuts across the Arabian desert, goes straight across. But even today, people don't do that because it's such harsh conditions. Apparently, he did it. And he got there very, very quickly. And so he cuts across and gets there. Jehoiakim was taken captive, but he would return to the throne of Judah. Once the throne was secured back in Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar goes back north into Syria. In 601 BC, Egypt and Babylon met again for battle on the plain of Gaza. So we know where Gaza is because so much has happened there in recent days, in last year. So they meet for battle there. Egypt at that point was driven out of Asia, but Babylon suffered heavy losses in the battle, crippling Nebuchadnezzar's army, requiring them to spend 18 months rebuilding the army. And it's during that time period that Jehoiakim in Judah rebels. He saw that the Babylonians had returned to Babylon. So he's thinking, I can get away with rebelling myself. He stopped paying the heavy tribute tax to Nebuchadnezzar. He'd paid it 3 times since 605 BC. We've got those records. So that Judah was now sandwiched in between the Egyptians, chafing at the bit to their south, and the Babylonians. Of course, we always talk about the Babylonians being the north. In reality, of course, they're in the east. But when they attack from the north. So you've got the Babylonians in the north, and you've got the Egyptians in the south, and Judah is sandwiched in between them. With the army rebuilt, Nebuchadnezzar marched out to begin collecting the tribute, the taxes that hadn't been paid for a few years. And he begins in Syria and puts down the various rebellions one by one, reestablishes his power. In 589 BC, Nebuchadnezzar invaded Judah for the second time. Jehoiakim was now 3 years late in paying taxes, and he dies. Suggestion, maybe he was killed, we don't know, but he dies. During Jehoiakim's short reign, that's Jehoiakim's son, Nebuchadnezzar marched against Jerusalem, besieged the city, and Jehoiakim surrendered and was taken prisoner on the 16th of March, 597 BC. It's nice when you have dates, isn't it? But we, again, using Babylonian records, we can get that. Nebuchadnezzar, at that point, removed the gold items that Solomon had made from the temple, as well as the temple treasuries, that which Hezekiah had showed, and the royal treasury. Deported at that point 10,000 Jews to Babylon, including officials and soldiers and craftsmen. Ezekiel was part of that group. These were the best of the people. Most of the nobility's already been taken in that first deportation. This is the second. They get the best of the craftsmen, the artisans. So this is definitely the cream of the crop of what the people that are left. Jehoiakim is removed as king. He's taken as a captive to Babylon as well. Harrison writes in Old Testament times, tablets excavated from a vaulted building near the Ishtar Gate. That, by the way, that's the Ishtar Gate. That it's reconstructed. It's been taken. It's in Berlin. That's why I want to go to Berlin. I want to see that. But that's the Ishtar Gate. That was one of the gates into Babylon. So right near here, as Harrison writes, they found tablets which afforded independent confirmation of this first captivity of Judah. The texts, which are dated between 595 and 570, were written in cuneiform and contained memorandum of rations of barley and oil issued to the captive princes and artisans, including Yukon, king of Fateland of Yahu, which is basically of Judah. Yahoo, Yahweh, you see that connection there. There's a direct reference to Jehoiakim, the Yukon there. And some of the tablets referred also to his 5 sons who accompanied him to Babylon. So we've got some independent confirmation. By the way, we put J's in these things. You know, the J as a J sound didn't come into effect in English until the mid-1700s. That is a new letter. So it was a Y sound. So when you see something like Yukon, Yahoo for Judah, it makes sense. We've corrupted languages right, left, and center, but that's the way it is. But anyway, Nebuchadnezzar appointed the next king, who was Zedekiah. And his real name was Mattaniah. He was, again, brother of Jehoiakim, and was one of the sons of Josiah. We'll get to that tomorrow. He installs him on the throne at the age of 21, a bit young. Nebuchadnezzar now controlled the entire area and had pushed Egypt back into its territory. So he has to reassert his authority, but once again, he's in control. Scripture writes in 2 Kings 24, verse 7, the king of Egypt did not march out from his land again. The king of Babylon conquered all the territory that the king of Egypt had formerly controlled between the stream of Egypt and the Euphrates River. Egypt had been very much a world power, and it will once again eventually have a lot more influence. If when we were at my mind just blanked on me, one of the 10 cities that we visited, Bet-Shan. If you go on top of the hill, there's a in the bottom. I should have a picture of this, but in the bottom there's the Roman city, and very much it's impressive there. But on top of the hill is the old Bet-Shan, which you read about in the Old Testament. But the major building up on top of the hill is an Egyptian building. It is from sort of 200s, 300s, 400s, someplace through there. So they're going to reassert power later as well. It was F.F. Bruce who wrote, Assyria had disappeared beyond recall. The Babylonian Empire now covered all the southern area of the former Assyrian Empire, while the Median Empire took over its northern provinces and continued to expand westward through Asia Minor. You can almost see where the next conflict's going to come from, and this is indeed where it does come from. So it was a joint Media and Babylon that conquered Assyria, divided up some of the land, but eventually Media is going to attack Babylon as well. And you're familiar with that from the end of, or from the middle as we have it, of Daniel. A few years later, Zedekiah begins planning a revolt against Babylon with Edom and Moab and Ammon and Tyre and Sidon. Mark talked about some of those. The Pharaoh now is Hophra. He promised Judah that Egypt would help Zedekiah in a revolt against Babylon. So Nebuchadnezzar, what does he do? Marches out yet again against Judah. And that's the final attack on Jerusalem. In 587, Egypt came to Judah's aid, and the Babylonians left Judah to fight Egypt, and then they returned to Jerusalem. And in 586, by that time, there's no food left inside Jerusalem. Babylon resumes the siege, and they've now been under siege, counting the whole time that he's been there for 2.5 years, and Jerusalem falls. Babylon breaches the walls of the city, and the following month, the city's burned and destroyed. Nebuchadnezzar and his army burned the temple, the royal palace, and all the houses in Jerusalem. Zedekiah, the king's captured, taken to Babylon with a few more captives. And you'll hear more about that, I'm sure, over the next day or so. But Babylon now was the undisputed world empire, remained so under Nebuchadnezzar. This is a wood engraving after an original painting by Edward Bendeman, which is showing Jews led away into prison in Babylon, it says. The city's on fire. You can see the Ark of the Covenant up there in the upper left-hand corner being taken. But yeah, he pillaged it without a doubt. The collapse of the Babylonian Empire, because as I said, it doesn't last even 100 years. Nebuchadnezzar dies in 562, so about 24 years or so after Jerusalem was conquered, Nebuchadnezzar dies. And the Babylonian Empire quickly disintegrated a number of short-lived kings. You notice that you see this a lot in the world empires. You've got one major, powerful king. There was Hammurabi earlier, Nebuchadnezzar now. But once they're gone, nobody wields that kind of power, and things just slowly disintegrate. And this happens here as well. But a number of short-lived kings who are murdered, who are assassinated. Nabonidus, and this is Nabonidus here, this is in the British Museum, but he was able to establish the empire for a short time and continued expanding as far south as Medina in Saudi Arabia. His son Belshazzar, who we're familiar with, was co-regent with his father over a decade, during which Nabonidus was absent from Babylon, living in Saudi Arabia. And Belshazzar basically was the sole ruler in Babylon. You talk about a co-regency, but when one of them is weeks, months away, travel time, basically you're ruling on your own, because there's no way you could confer with your dad about anything. If they sent him a note, it might be months before he got a reply back, and then you've already moved on from there. So it was in 539 that Babylon was invaded by the Medo-Persians, who quickly claimed victory, and Babylon as the world power is over. So very, very short-lived, not even 100 years. Despite its short stay as a world power, though, Babylon was the cultural capital of all Mesopotamia for nearly 2,000 years, under various empires, various kings, even following its conquest by Alexander the Great. They still exerted, Babylon had influence over the areas, not in this empire, but Babylon itself had a lot of influence. And again, it's largely the result of the success of Hammurabi, going back to that first Babylonian Empire, who brought many cultures in Mesopotamia together into one Babylonian culture. And Hammurabi's one we have to thank for that. The culture was then adopted by the kingdoms and the empires that controlled Mesopotamia following the collapse of that first empire. They each basically took on what Hammurabi had established. That's where the Jews ended up, was in Babylon. The year Carchemish was defeated, Jeremiah had warned Jerusalem and Judah that because they wouldn't repent, they would be in Babylonian captivity for 70 years. Now, I've not even lived 70 years, some of you have, but I haven't. And that's quite a long time. So they're going to be there for a generation or so in there. This, by the way, is a display in the Citadel in Jerusalem. It depicts them going into Babylonian captivity. And here's what Jeremiah wrote. This is Jeremiah 25, starting at verse 8. Therefore, the Lord of heaven's armies says, you've not listened to what I said, so I, the Lord, affirm that I will send for all the peoples of the north, and my servant King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon. I will bring them against this land and its inhabitants and all the nations that surround it. I will utterly destroy the land, its inhabitants, and all the surrounding nations, and make them everlasting ruins. I will make them objects of horror and hissing scorn. I will put an end to the sounds of joy and gladness and the glad celebration of brides and grooms in these lands. I'll put an end to the sound of people grinding meal. I'll put an end to lamps shining in their houses. The whole area will become a desolate wasteland. These nations will be subject to the king of Babylon for 70 years. And by the way, from the time of the first group until they get to come back is 70 years, till Cyrus says they can return. So that was indeed a 70-year. The first exile, as I mentioned, 606 BC, and the second 597. That's when Nebuchadnezzar attacked Jerusalem and took away the captives, including Ezekiel. And then Jeremiah recorded. By the way, when you look at the numbers in the different accounts, Kings and Chronicles and Jeremiah, there's different numbers. And that's what is. The possibility is when Jeremiah recorded the numbers, which is a lower number, he may have just been listing those from Jerusalem and not from the whole area of Judah. This is what 2 Kings writes. We find in 2 Kings. So Judah was taken into exile away from its land. Here's the official record of the number of people Nebuchadnezzar carried into exile. In the 7th year, 3,023 Jews. In Nebuchadnezzar's 18th year, 832 people from Jerusalem. Notice this does say from Jerusalem. And in Nebuchadnezzar's 23rd year, Nebuzaradan, the captain of the royal guard, carried into exile 745 Judeans. In all, 4,600 people went into exile. But from others, it was in the thousands. It's a lot more than that. So this seemed to be concentrating at times just on certain areas that were going into exile. Third attack, as I mentioned, 586, when he destroyed Jerusalem. There is actually a further deportation in 581 BC, not listed in Scripture, but mentioned in other writings and referenced by those who've written about this. And that one was to make sure that there was no further uprisings, as there was when the governor who had been appointed by Babylon was assassinated, Gedaliah. And we read about that in the 2 Kings. We'll see that later on Thursday. But the Jewish people were not allowed to return to Jerusalem until 539, 538. I think 539 was the edict, 538 when they were able to go, arriving in 536 BC. So it was indeed 70 years after the exile that they showed back up. So the first group of captives, the nobility, again, this is from the Citadel, includes Daniel, and a lot of those were selected to enter the service of the kingdom, which generally indicates they would have become eunuchs, because that's what they did. And most civil servants in those days were eunuchs. It's not necessarily conclusive that they were, but it's thought that they probably were. Remember, that had been prophesied by Isaiah to Hezekiah. And those who entered the service of Babylon seemed to be based in and around the city of Babylon. If we can take what happened to Daniel and Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego to be the norm, because we see them interacting amongst the officials as one of the civil servants, basically, of the government. At least some of the second group of captives that included Ezekiel were settled in the land of Babylon, and we can discover some of the conditions that they were living in from the writings, especially of Ezekiel. Some at least were near the Kibar River. Some translations have Kibar Canal, and it probably was more of a canal than a river as we know it today. But that seems to have been a man-made stream that provided irrigation from the Euphrates for the area. It would seem they lived in brick houses, so it's not any sort of concentration camp. They lived in brick houses. Ezekiel says, chapter 4, and you, son of man, take a brick, set it in front of you, and inscribe a city on it, Jerusalem. So you're familiar with that. He reenacts what's going to happen. He enacts what's going to happen to Jerusalem. But again, they have bricks, okay? And then down in verse 12, it tells Ezekiel, while they are watching, dig a hole in the wall. Carry your belongings out through it. And again, clay brick, you could dig a hole through the wall and exit. So he is enacting what was going to happen to Jerusalem, and that people would dig holes in the wall to get out. So it would seem they had quite a bit of freedom of movement within Babylon itself. And they also had correspondence with those back in Judah. You might think, was no postal service, and no, there's not. But we know that in Jeremiah 29 that he wrote a message to those in exile, and they wrote an answer back. So they were able to deliver messages backwards and forwards. Here's what Jeremiah wrote to them in chapter 29. It says, this is what the Lord God Almighty, the God of Israel, says to all those I carried into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. Build houses, settle down, plant gardens, eat what they produce. Marry and have sons and daughters. Find wives from your sons. Give your daughters in marriage, so that they too may have many sons and daughters. Increase in number there. Do not decrease. Also seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which I've carried you into exile. Pray to the Lord for it, because if it prospers, you too will prosper. Now that's set against the background. There's a group of Israelites saying, listen, we're not going to be here very long. We need to do all we can to get back. And Jeremiah is saying, no. Settle down. You're going to be there a while. And just get about your normal lives and support your new country. Because if that country prospers, you're going to have a good life there. Don't listen to the deceiving prophets delivering a message of hope that they're going to return soon. They've got to wait till 70 years. So it's going to be a while. And it would, by the way, get worse before it got better. It did, but it did get better. While in exile, there was a sense of despondency and depression. Think of Psalm 139, which Boney M. made very famous. Don McLean did a good version of it, by the way, as well. By the waters of Babylon, we sat down and wept for Israel. It keeps going, but it's lovely. But you have that whole, you see that they're despondent because they're not in Israel, and they're so much wanting to be back. So they hung your harps on the weeping willow tree, sort of idea there. I did have Psalm 139 there, by the way. Glanced down there. By the rivers of Babylon we sat and wept when we remembered Zion. There on the poplars we hung our harps, for there our captives asked for our songs. Our tormentors demanded songs of joy. They said, "Sing us one of the songs of Zion." How can we sing the songs of the Lord while in a foreign land? If I forget you, Jerusalem, may my right hand forget its skill. May my tongue cling to the roof of my mouth if I do not remember you, if I do not consider Jerusalem my highest joy. So you see their view. And keep in mind, when they lived there, they weren't faithful to God at all. And yet they're in captivity now, and they're longing to be back where they can worship Yahweh. Interesting how captivity changed their mindset. But the psychological effect of going to a strange land, which was radically different from Judah, would have been immense. They're used to mountains, which gave them some sense of security. And although they would have been familiar with some of the wilderness areas, they wouldn't have had really the concept of the open spaces of Mesopotamia. And then to realize that it was because their God had forsaken them would have made what they felt even more acute. Harrison writes, although they had been warned that they'd be punished by being taken in captive to Babylon, they were loath to believe the serious nature of the prophetic pronouncements. When captivity literally overtook them, they felt that God had abandoned them in their hour of need, and their flimsy faith was completely shattered. All that remained for them was the memory of a sad past and the forbidding prospect of an embittered future. Now, others took on board why they were there, realized the need they had of changing their lives, to giving up idolatry, to return to serving Yahweh. There obviously were some restrictions. Being captives, they couldn't return to Jerusalem, even if they wanted to. They weren't allowed to do that. But it wasn't a prison camp. They did have a degree of freedom. They could establish family life there in Babylon. That's what Babylonians wanted, was for them to become part of Babylon, part of the Babylonian culture. So they had to adapt to a new life in a new and strange location. Harrison says the magnificent buildings, by the way, Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon was pretty magnificent. The magnificent buildings and spacious cities of Mesopotamia made the temple and the capital city of Jerusalem appear paltry and insignificant by comparison. The open plains and fertile soil stood in marked contrast to the rocky crags and indifferent arable land of Judah, which the general prosperity and opulence of contemporary Mesopotamia must have aroused many wistful recollections of the departed glory of Judah in the minds of the older captives. No wonder when they're allowed to go back under Ezra, well, initially Zerubbabel, then Ezra, no wonder so many didn't want to go. It was a really nice place to live. And some of them stayed. And we know they're still there in 100 AD. There was a big group of Jews still in Babylon. What did they do in exile? Why were they taken into exile? Well, Nebuchadnezzar needed all rebellion out of Israel so he could concentrate on putting down Egypt. So he needed to get rid of Judah. He was also able to use the abilities of the Jews in his building projects in Babylon. He put them to work for him. Harrison says, in leading Judah into captivity, they had other considerations in view. First, they were anxious to ensure the reduction of Palestinian military opposition to the Babylonian regime so that the empire could consolidate its western holdings in preparation for a further attack on Egypt. In the second place, the captives provided Nebuchadnezzar with the gratuitous service of craftsmen and artisans for his ambitious building projects in Babylonia. By deporting potential leaders and skilled workmen alike, the Babylonians achieved at one blow the two main purposes of their conquest of Palestine. So it was to Nebuchadnezzar's advantage to get rid of Judah for the time being. Helped him at home, helped him in his advancing on Egypt. Although Nebuchadnezzar was renowned as a military strategist, he seems to have been more interested in culture and the pursuit of a peaceful life than in his military conquests. That was necessary for him to have the peaceful life he wanted to have. Greek historians, as well as royal inscriptions from this era, talk about the splendor and magnificence of Babylon and the efforts of Nebuchadnezzar to make this the most splendid city in the world. These are in the British Museum. These are terracotta cylinders, and they detail Nebuchadnezzar's building works. And so we've got records of all the things he was doing. The city itself was enclosed by a double wall of defensive fortifications. It enclosed an area of 200 square miles. So it's no small city. 90%, by the way, was given over to parks and fields and gardens. So a lot of greenery there. The remaining 10% occupied by temples, public buildings, and private houses. Cities interconnected by a network of waterways and canals with a great bridge connecting the two halves of the city. There was, of course, the famous Hanging Gardens that you've, I'm sure, heard about, regarded by the Greeks as one of the 7 wonders of the world. And to build all of that would have required a labor force, which the Judean exiles would have been forced to work at, basically as slaves, although they were living in their own. They were unpaid work, and so that's he got his workforce. This, by the way, is a piece of the Ishtar Gate. You saw the picture of the reconstruction of it. They have all these images. This is a lion. This is in the British Museum, and it would cover pretty much this wall. I mean, it's good size. It's good size. Harrison writes that the inferior classes merely exchanged servility in Judah for enslavement in Mesopotamia, and which the Babylonians and Chaldeans were in general good-natured and tolerant. There is some reason for believing that the common people suffered harsh treatment while laboring to beautify the imperial cities, as Isaiah 47:6 had predicted. So those with a higher social status seem to have had some freedom in choosing their employment. They were able to rise to positions of prominence and responsibility, such as Daniel, Nehemiah later on did. But as attractive as some aspects of Babylonian life would have been, there was always the inescapable fact that they were in exile. Exile from home, exile from the temple, exile from their God. Jeremiah wrote to them, and it's recorded in chapter 25. We read the bit from chapter 27. Settle down, marry, grow crops, live at peace with their neighbors, while working for the day that God would hear their prayers and bring them back to the land that he had given them. And that's from the citadel, where they have a display just showing their life in Babylon. So that's where we're going to leave them. Israel in captivity. We're not going to get them out of captivity. They will eventually come out, but that's not for this week. Questions, comments, observations. 58 minutes, 40 seconds in case you wanted to know.
It's interesting in that their exile was forced on them, but when they came to the country, they were encouraged to take part in the society where they were accepted. That's similar if we think about the forced immigration that's happening around the world today. Mm-hmm. People are leaving their countries because of famine, of political unrest, or whatever. And I just wondered, is there a parallel between the two as to how people view when they arrive in a place like Great Britain or a place like France or a place like the USA, whether they're going to do the same as...
And I think we can see some of that in Daniel, that he rose quickly and he made enemies. They didn't like the Jews, as they became known as. By the way, they don't become known as Jews until the captivity. So really, they're Israelites or Judeans before that, and after the captivity, they're referred to as Jews. But we see a lot of that. The suspicion, they're doing things different, and so you remember they tried to entrap Daniel in his prayer life. I see a lot of that parallel in the way sometimes we view immigrants today.
Yeah, it's exactly.
Yeah.
They end up in, that's where the Indian community is. That's where the Pakistani, that's where the Irish community is. That's where, the immigrant community is.
Yeah, and being an immigrant myself, see the difference is though I'm more like you, so therefore I'm accepted, not like people who look different and sound different. Yeah, Irish. There you go. Yeah, and those of us who are immigrants, we realize that, but some of us are, because my people are from over here, going back far enough, that we've got common roots, and so it's never a problem. But when you look different or sound radically different, even though I do sound different, I know that, but it's you be looked on.
In the passage in Jeremiah is to not stay out of, not be in a unit yourself, but to become part of the society.
Influence society. Get in there. Yeah.
But unfortunately, that doesn't happen, does it?
But notice, if you remember what Jeremiah wrote to him there is, grow in number. Why? Because we're going to bring you back. So there is that aspect of things as well. But don't refrain from having children. You need to have children so that the nation continues, the remnant continues. And we've got the whole idea of the remnant that's going to be coming back. So all that's going to go on as well. And by the way, that's important in God's plan, because the Messiah is going to come. He's going to be born back in the land of Israel. And so they need to get back. And they need to be faithful to Yahweh for him to be born. So all that's coming to play. This is all part of God's overarching plan for the Messiah coming. So, yeah. It's 10:13 and 31 seconds. Patrick, you're up next. What time do we need to be back for?
Let's say 25 past.
25 past. Take 10 minutes and a couple more. So,
Thanks, John.
you're very welcome, Simon.